so much for coming, and thanks, Chuck, for the invitation. I'm not here to talk about Passive House, and actually, my growing up in the Passive House world is really the reason for this presentation, which I'm calling Inside Out. It's also the name of the book, because what we don't think about in architecture is really why do we occupy buildings the way we do? Why is the building the default? And so what my work is really doing is questioning this boundary condition between the binaries of inside out, nature versus human space. So, and I have notes here, so I hope you don't mind if I'm looking through my notes, but a little hot. So first, what I'm planning to do is introduce the scale of what we're now calling the indoor microbiome, and why it's so important to understand, and then we'll go through the therapeutic history of fresh air and how it's been used as a health tool throughout history before we transition to what we now think of as normal indoor conditions and indoor space. And I'll talk about this at two scales. First at the urban commercial building scale, something we're probably more familiar with, and then I have a conceptual case study project called the Ecotone. And then I want to talk about these same concepts in urbanizing, developing, lower middle income settings in developing regions. And this image in the background, I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's a weird one to start on. But it's Willis Carrier, the inventor of modern air conditioning at the 1939 World Fair. So like I said, more on that later. The footprint of the interior environment is substantial, physically, psychologically, and ecologically. I really like this graphic because what it's showing is that the land area occupied by Manhattan, the indoor area on that island is about 3 times the size of the actual land that it's built on. That's something that was once an outlier, but is really becoming more and more the case around the world as these mega cities develop. So the indoor environment is a huge, huge impact on our well-being and our health and just our physical being. This enclosed environment, particularly when controlled by mechanical ventilation, is a unique ecosystem that researchers are now calling the indoor microbiome. So I want to pose a question. We have 2 conditions, indoor and outdoor. When you're thinking of the air, how many people think indoor air is healthier than outdoor air? There's
depends where you are.
Okay, depends on how many people think outdoor air is healthier? In the United States.
Also depends.
Yes. So a lot of timid answers because nobody wants to get it wrong here, but the majority of Americans think that indoor environments are healthier. But what the EPA is showing is that indoor environments are 3 to 5 times more unhealthy than outdoor air in the United States. That is not the case in places that have high particulate matter, a number of different countries. But in the United States, since the adoption of the Clean Air Act in 1970, our air is really, really good here. Air pollution is a thing, but it's not quite the thing we think it is, except for inside our buildings. That's really an unhealthy environment that we need to be aware of. I went too far. Well, I didn't skip much, but this is buildings. We know what buildings look like. We spend 90% of our time indoors. That's a huge amount of time, and that doesn't even include the time we spend in transit, in cars and vehicles, which is another 4 to 5%. So now I'll show us some kind of fun images. This is real, y'all. This is despite the health perceptions of outdoor air today, there have always been certain positive health implications associated with outdoor air. In the late 19th century, excuse me, there was a popular parenting book that recommended the process of airing out your children. And that was to renew and purify the blood. So this, by providing regular access to fresh air, infants could theoretically build their immune system to ward off common colds. And in 1922, as a solution for families living in urban environments without a place to air out their baby, the baby cage was invented. So this device, which is also known as the window crib, was a small outdoor sleeping compartment attached to apartment windows so that urban babies could still have access to the healing effects of outdoor air, which were believed to be just as necessary as healthy food for children. Most of the people here are probably pretty familiar with the sanatorium movement in response to tuberculosis. In 1840, a study was published that showed people who worked outdoors, such as farmers, shepherds, appeared immune to tuberculosis, and that people that lived indoors were more susceptible to the disease. So it was reasoned that patients should learn from the lifestyles of outdoor laborers and spend more time breathing fresh outdoor air. And this notion was a foundation for open air therapy and the open air method, and the sanatorium movement, which was a standard treatment for tuberculosis until the invention of antibiotics in the 1950s. At that point, this massive technological development, fresh air therapy was no longer the primary antidote for infections. Naturally ventilated spaces, however, still serve a valuable purpose in lower middle income countries as an approach to health-related facilities, particularly in low resource settings. In a similar response to the tuberculosis epidemic, the open air school movement emerged as a hybrid between a sanatorium and schoolhouse, designed to limit exposure to tuberculosis in children who were deemed to be pre-tubercular. Interest in the open air school movement spread quickly to the United States, where 2 Rhode Island doctors opened the first open air school in 1908 for students who had been exposed to tuberculosis. And then history repeats itself. We saw this again during COVID. The concept of the fresh air cure seemed to return temporarily with the COVID-19 pandemic. New York City, for example, which had over 1 million children in public school in 2020, approved over 1,000 proposals for classes to be held outdoors during the fall of 2020. Now I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about technology. You know, we talked about antibiotics as this cure, and developed this antibiotic worldview where we would have this pill for every ill type of situation, where if you have a problem, we're going to treat it with antibiotics. If you have a energy problem, we're going to treat it with a mechanical system and stop the climate crisis. That is not the case. We cannot technology our way out of a situation that we created with social and cultural values. So it's important to think of all of those things together. So this is kind of a funny picture. This and the next one, this I took at COP28 in Dubai in the fall, the convening of partners, the sustainability conference. This is an energy transitions pavilion. This is the back of the energy transition pavilion because it's in Dubai and they needed air conditioning. So they loaded it up with fossil fuel powered energy transition. So here we are talking about energy transitions. Here we are using fossil fuels. So a bit of a contrast that I found silly. So this image again. This is Willis Carrier and his friends standing inside an air-conditioned igloo at the 1939 St. Louis World Fair. Growing cultural connections between climate control and social status, as well as advances in mechanical conditioning technologies and access to affordable energy, led to a fairly abrupt transition from fresh air and natural ventilation strategies to mechanical ventilation and all the health implications that that entails. Before the term air conditioning emerged, before it was introduced in the 1930s, this environment was described as man-made weather or weatherlessness, manufactured weather, and these were really promoted as tenets of modernism, of this dominion over nature. We don't have to respond to climate anymore because we have man-made environments. And modern air required custom environments that necessitated the complete enclosure, the separation of indoor and outdoor space. That's when the facade really became the separating force and controls were given over to the engineers and the systems. I'm from Houston. I'm a Texan. I went to college in Rhode Island, and I went to the mall, And there was a movie theater, and I was like, where's your skating rink in your mall? Because in Houston, we have a skating rink in our mall. And this was really known as this triumph because Houston, Texas has a year-round skating rink, and it's really absurd, but Houston was really trying to be this modern beacon of weatherlessness, this modern tenant. Does anybody know what this still is from? I'd be impressed if you did. It's from a movie, Things to Come, from, I have the date up here, 1936. Oh, you could have cheated. You could have just read the caption. But what's happening here is it's from the 1930s, and this is the great-grandfather. He's telling his great-granddaughter. They're looking at story pictures. A picture of New York comes up, and she's asking, why did they stick up into the sky like that? Why did they have all those openings? And he's saying, well, that was before they had machines. They had to put it into the sky so that they used the light from the sun. They couldn't create their own environment, so they had to rely on the environment. And this was, in the film, promoted as this terrible thing of how backwards New York was and how they had this vision of the future that was completely independent of climate, which we know is not possible. Early office towers, such as the home insurance building known as the first skyscraper, this opened in 1885. It used operable windows to provide ventilation, lighting, and passive heating. And this generation of buildings was bulky and compact, and only 20 to 40% glazing. Our buildings today, those are 50 to 80% glazing. The building on the right, which you might know, this is the Milan building in San Antonio, the first air-conditioned tower in 1928. So less than 50 years after the first skyscraper, the first air-conditioned skyscraper opened, and from that point on, it became an expectation of the modern workplace. And weird transitions, I know. That building was constructed in 1928, and right around that time, in the 20s and 30s, self-service, sorry, this has got quite a ring to it. Self-service grocery stores emerged as, in the United States, made possible by refrigeration technologies, the same thing that we use in air conditioning, but also other products that were geared towards sanitary lifestyles, disposable products. What we're looking at here is DuPont cellophane. This was a huge driver of grocery stores because you could see that a product was not touched. It had no contact with flies, fingers, or food, which is the trio of the gospel of germs. And it really played upon the germ phobias of people providing for their families, largely women who this was marketed to. So perceptions of germ aversion and hygiene quickly became associated with class and sophistication. So this image on the right says, Mom, I'm so fresh and so clean. Mom says I'm so fresh and so clean sometimes. She had to wrap me in cellophane to keep me that way. So silly, kind of absurd. We're not going to wrap our children in cellophane. Or are we? I mean, look at what we're doing with these buildings. We're creating these disposable glass enclosures and keeping our children inside them. So, what was really thought of as something whimsical, that's kind of what we're doing. So by 2050, 80% of humans are expected to live in cities. And with land at a premium, more high-rise buildings are being constructed than ever before, and we're seeing these sealed, fully conditioned buildings, regardless of climate, health, culture, local identity, and they're popping up all around the world. These are buildings from Russia to Dubai, two very different climates, very similar building technologies. So what do we consider normal? People know this still, right? Yes, from Office Space. There's no caption there, but that brings me to a current project that's ongoing, so I'm going to present some very preliminary, not so exciting research, but I think some interesting things are coming from it. So COVID was an opportunity. It's a disruption, but disruptions are really opportunities for major drivers of radical change. And so with looking at human health and ventilation and spread of disease. I think there was a ton of potential in that disruption. I don't know if it was long enough, but at least now people are talking about indoor air quality and human health inside buildings. So I'm currently studying 4 office buildings in the US Southeast that belong to a single company, an architecture firm with a national presence. I'm going to flip through these images super fast because it's not super important, but we're looking at Atlanta, Charlotte, Durham, and Washington, D.C. And the reason we're looking at these 4 spaces is that 3 of them have direct access to outdoor terraces that's either private or for their company. And I also have air quality monitors located throughout the spaces. So the goal of the study is to understand the indoor conditions when people choose to use outdoor space, hoping that this would signify certain thresholds or tolerances for indoor comfort. So a lot of people probably when you go to the lecture on Friday about well building standard, biophilia is a big topic, bringing plants in, bringing nature in, and having access to nature in the workplace are big workplace initiatives. So the slide that's about to load, is the ugly data slide, but what it's showing is that we're tracking carbon dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter. So I'm not showing the particulate matter here, but in this example, this is from the pilot study. You can see that this green line, that's threshold for good. Anything below that point, we're good. So this office building in Charlotte is doing well for carbon dioxide, means they're ventilating well. Same green line for particulate matter, that comes from combustion. No, this is TVOC, sorry. TVOC comes from furnishings, paint. You see a big spike around lunchtime. Anybody know where those emissions might come from? Microwaves, microwaving food. Those people who bring fish to the office, it is a measurable impact on human health. So don't be that guy. But cleaning products, that's another way to introduce toxins into the workplace. This is still very high quality air. It just has a few spikes. Someone with a lot of cologne walks through a space, that will be a measurable spike. So all 4 of these spaces have high quality air. Atlanta has the lowest with, and I'm not generalizing about Atlanta, I'm saying this one building in Atlanta has 72% roughly of high quality air. And the reason this is all important, and we also asked what their perceptions of the air quality in the space was. Do you feel like it's good? Yes. Everybody in the Charlotte office agreed that they felt that the air was good in the space. This is ranked from highest satisfaction to lowest satisfaction using the Center for Built Environment Occupant Satisfaction Survey. It's an open office, so you would expect the ease of interaction to be quite high. At the bottom, also in an open office, you'll see the noise level, temperature, amount of space. Those are going to be the least amount of satisfaction. I want to go back to this for a second because we saw that the air quality meters, that the air is quite good based on industry standards. 3/4 of the offices, 3 out of the 4 offices had direct access to the outdoors through these terraces. But what we found was that employees still expressed a longing for the outdoors, for fresh air, for nature in the workplace, even though on paper, these employers are providing exactly what ASHRAE, Reset, WELL are saying that they should provide for a healthy workplace environment. People were still not satisfied. They wanted connection to the outdoors. So we asked them to participate in interviews where the bulk of people responded that they spend more time outdoors, outside of work, on vacations or weekends. Probably the same for you. When you're in studio, you're in studio. When you're at home, you might be out doing other things. Outdoors, I mean. Also, the majority expressed that they believe the outdoors to be healthier, particularly from a mental health standpoint, because they needed a break, needed a place to reset from the workplace environment. So despite all 4 offices having really exceptional ventilation standards and high quality air, occupants overwhelmingly wanted fresh air in the workplace. One of them said, I want real wind inside the buildings. I would definitely love more fresh air, but it's kind of like, I'm not going to go pop open a window in the office. It would be nice to have fresh air, although the air inside of offices is probably better than outside, certainly summer, that's usually the case. So they were not satisfied with the air, despite it being, I know I'm repeating myself, but the building engineer said, we are providing what we should. Occupants are still not satisfied. You're not getting the kind of ephemeral qualities of nature through this filtered air, this man-made weather. People would saying, I can get this through a window, but I can't get the feel of a seasonal change. And I can, which is part of the reason I go outside on a day like today, or the next one. But it isn't even just the amount of lumens on the work surface, it's how the light changes throughout the course of the day. I don't need to read that whole thing, but you all understand, it's when you go outside and you sit under a shade tree and you have the speckled light above, that's a really lovely environment that you can't recreate indoors, nor should you. It exists in one place, why do we need to recreate it in a technological way? So this is the outdoor space in Atlanta, and what we found, again, high quality indoor air, people wanted more access to space, and we also tracked more access to outdoor air. We also tracked how many people use this during the day, and it was very, very rarely used. So there's a big contrast between what we're providing in these workplace settings and what people are actually using, because this is not cutting it. This is not meeting people's needs for outdoor space, or connection to nature, rather. So, these are things you've probably learned in class. There are ways to improve thermal perception without actually changing indoor conditions like temperature. Biophilia, bringing plants, nature, more natural ventilation inside, having access to nature. Thermal stimulation, so when temperature changes throughout the day, when you have a temperature gradient. Mechanical ventilation. Mechanical systems are designed for thermal neutrality. Everything is consistent all throughout the building, but it turns out our bodies don't like that. We like more stimulation. And also control. This sounds manipulative, but if you just give someone a thermostat, even if it doesn't work, they will be happier within the indoor environment because they think they have control over it. They will be happier if they do actually have control, but perception is important too. So the point I'm getting at with all this is that none of these strategies question our relationship with nature, buildings, or the planet. It's really just a technological approach, and it's not changing the paradigm of the way we inhabit the planet, which, this lecture series, critical path, that paradigm needs to shift. We can't just keep throwing technology, throwing around the word sustainability. We need to dramatically change our relationship with buildings, the built environment, and nature. So, I've fallen behind here. This is a project, a conceptual project that I did while I was working at a firm in New Orleans, at a firm called SQ Dumas Ripple. It was a competition project we spent about 2 weeks on, so very conceptual, but I think really thought-provoking in the sense that it was a facade design competition. We said, no, it's not going to be a layer. We're not going to design a facade. We're going to design a space that acts like a thermal buffer. So we're inspired by the ecological system of an ecotone. This is the region of transition between 2 ecosystems. And it's a very rich, ecologically rich space where species come together and a huge degree of ecological richness. So what this competition asked is, what role does a facade system play in making workers happier and healthier? The modern approach to building facades is a relatively thin line between inside and out. That's this image on the left here. There are other approaches to thicken up the facade. You could have a double skin facade, but that in-between space is really just designated for the people who clean the glass or service the system. It's not a spatial experience. It's kind of this no man's land between the two layers, which is really only accessed by building maintenance. So what we sought to create in the image on the right was a layering of habitable space that would create a gradient of thermal zones. So instead, what we propose is more of a spatial condition instead of a material condition. So spatial instead of material, blurring the edges between inside and out. The diagram on the left here shows our intent, a spatial facade as a thermal buffer, and we implemented a series of layering systems that would create this space. Now keep in mind, this was just a competition, so it wasn't, the formation of the layers in the form was fairly fluid, but it was grounded in the local climate, which I mentioned is in Brooklyn, New York. We were designing a 230,000 square foot, 30-story office building for a technology hub. So our layers were entirely based on the local climate. We studied wind speed and direction because we knew natural ventilation would be an integral part of the thermal mixing zones, and we wanted to channel the southern summer breezes while blocking the northwest breezes in the New York climate. Because we were just testing a concept, we started with a simple shape, the square, and started to erode the edges to form these spatial zones. The facade had to become adaptable in order to respond appropriately to both the changing outdoor conditions as well as the interior programmatic needs. So in the summer condition, the layers were largely quite open. The south-facing exposure is shielded from solar heat gain by deciduous plants, so meaning it loses its leaves in the winter. And so starting from the outside, we had a metal screen with a mist, and then we also used that mist again, get this, to dehumidify the air. Okay, so we're using water in the air to remove other water from the air, because if that mist is cooled below the dew point of the air, water from the air will condense on those water droplets. So it's a really simple way to just passively dehumidify. And I'm talking about, the dew point that water needs to be conditioned at 65 degrees or something like that to help dehumidify the air. And then there was a series of openings, and it would become kind of more and more conventionally conditioned as you got towards the interior of the space with these structural tubes, which these were our structural system, but it was also part of our stack ventilation system. And there'll be a diagram that shows that a little bit better. In the winter condition, those trees would lose their leaves, so you'd get a lot more sun in there. There would be a layer of glass on the outside that could close or open depending on the different conditions, so it would create more and more buffers, basically, through these closing layers. And then the water mist that we used to dehumidify would then humidify the air based on what condition the outdoor air was and the temperature of the water. So looking at this in diagrammatic form, a key component of this project was that we had, instead of a large HVAC unit on the roof, is we had what we called a forest. So that forest would treat the air the same way that the ventilation system would. And in the wintertime, in this example here in the winter, that roof would be closed and that purified air could then be ventilated back through the space. So you're keeping the heat you've already spent on the building, but purifying that air. In the summer condition, that air would vent out into the sky because it was the hot air coming up through the stack effect. The rest of the conditioning would be through a radiant approach in the slabs. So that roof condition also provided an amenity for building occupants. Here you can see in the summer condition where it's likely quite warm, and air is allowed to escape through the roof. And the human body, as sensitively as we treat it, we're actually quite durable, and our body can endure a wide range of conditions. and prefers to endure a wide range of conditions throughout the day, throughout the different seasons. It's good for blood pressure and general health. So what we did was created these different thermal zones throughout the space. And some offices do this. One of the buildings I'm studying in Washington, D.C., they actually create temperature gradients so that people can choose where they want to sit based on if they're typically hot or cold at work. Operated natural openings so that the natural ventilation could come through. And we looked at the WELL building standard to try and meet that criteria as well. So I don't need to go all into that, but from a site perspective, we wanted that idea of ecological mixing and blurred boundaries to be evident in all aspects of the project. So on the site, we're located right on the East River next to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So we're pulling the river into the site where we would have a natural swimming pool and water filtration area, but also pulling some of the bike path from the street into the site. So it wasn't just, this is our site boundary and this is our site boundary, but it was a fluid condition. So like I said, this was a competition. We submitted a 10-page PDF to a group of jurors, and they talked about it in a room, and then they presented it back to an audience. So it was a unique exercise in just putting together a document that really explains a project in 10 pages. So the jury recognized innovative thinking. What they said was, despite the technical holes in the project we have now, the key thing is thermodynamics didn't change, and they will not change. Hot air rises, there's a benefit of thermal mass. The building relies on the basic laws of thermodynamics. And that's the key thing I really want to get across, and we'll talk about in the next project as well, is that if you just do one thing with the project, hot air rises, thermal mass, these types of things, these are tested measures. You don't have to, over-engineer the building because the simple things work. So if you do, I don't want to say do less, but do things more intentionally, you can get a lot of traction with that. So they said that there were lots of technical holes, but the spirit is there. And we won the competition. I don't know if I said that, but it was a winning competition entry, and they really appreciated the thoughtfulness of it. It was not well resolved. There were issues that they brought up with acoustics, fire rating. Who cares? We'll figure that out. But it's really questioning how we make buildings, especially urban high-rise buildings. So with this next project, the last project, when we talk about climate change, the impacts of climate change are felt differently across the globe. This can be known as a threat multiplier, so that if you're already in a disadvantaged situation, the effects of climate change will impact you even more. Protective atmospheres, what this project is called, this is part of a multidisciplinary, multi-institution international effort launched in 2018. It involves designers, entomologists, bug scientists basically, and social scientists and artists to address housing design implications of mosquito-borne disease in rural Tanzania. So as designers, we're looking for the links between vector-borne disease and climate change and housing. So I've been in the past year or so to several entomology conference, public health conferences, and everybody looks at me and they say, sorry, architect, why are you here? We're talking about health, we're talking about mosquitoes. And I say, okay, yeah, but 80% of mosquito bites happen in buildings. They happen indoors. So the architect has a direct role over this major global public health issue. So this is something we're doing in the design studio. It's like one of the early projects in its early stages. But when we're looking at the critical tools for improving health, the right to adequate housing and ownership is not typically the first thing to come to mind. Instead, we talk about investing in health, creating more economic opportunities, and establishing physical protections, separation from inside and out. Adequate housing is able to influence all three of these areas, and the pandemic has brought its importance back into the spotlight. So looking at a climate map, annual mean temperature, we know this is typically warmer towards the equator. So geographically, these are the tropics. Climatically, these are the tropical regions that we're talking about where we're most likely to have vector-borne issues, mosquitoes, malaria, dengue, that sort of thing. And then if you look at this next image, these never really shows up very well. I should change the colors, but the blue, the purple color, those are the top 10 fastest growing regions. They're all in the tropics except for Nepal. So the other problem we have is this is where the wealth is. So let me flip back. There's a difference between building technologies being developed for these wealthy climates, but the growth is happening in the tropics. So mosquito issues, probably not something you talk about a lot in your design studios. It's something we should be thinking about. So we don't need to know too much about how mosquito-borne diseases are spread, but that vectors, mosquitoes, come in through the homes, and 80% occurs primarily at night, indoors. So it's not happening outside, where a lot of people think it is. It's indoors at night because mosquitoes are attracted to, this is a theory, but carbon dioxide, and when it's trapped in a small space, that's when you get the mosquito bites. So when it comes to vector control, there are multiple ways that this is dealt with at a scalable level. Bed nets, this is very common. Doesn't really matter the climate or the region or the culture, but UNICEF, the UN, kind of deploys all of these bed nets. But what happens is people don't use them because, first of all, sometimes they use them to put over their crops to keep the bugs out, or the rabbits or other animals who might eat their crops. Excuse me, but also within the bed nets, it's quite hot. I don't know if anybody slept under a bed net or in a tent or that sort of thing, but you don't get a lot of ventilation. So when you don't have air conditioning, you don't have a lot of ventilation in a space, you don't want to be sleeping under a sheet. Insecticide treatment, this is another common way to deal with mosquitoes. I like this image, this transition, because this person is all decked out in their PPE, fully protected, and then there's this little guy, breathing in all these chemicals from the pesticides. That's one issue. The other issue is that mosquitoes evolve very quickly. Their lifespan is very short, so generationally, they evolve very quickly. So think of this as a metaphor for life. I'm talking about mosquitoes, but when you use technology to halt these problems, life finds a way. It's a Jurassic Park quote. But in housing, you can add mosquito nets, screens to windows, seal up the cracks, these sort of things, insecticides, vaccines. But none of these strategies question our relationship with nature, buildings, or the planet. So that's really the theme today of why do we rely on technology when we really should be rethinking the paradigm of things that we do, and whether it's in public health, global health. I was talking about indoor health in urban office buildings. This is really the same conversation. The responsibility we have as architects and designers to change these types of environments and change the conversation. So in this ongoing research project, we ask what role the most humble of building materials, the brick, can play in global public health interventions. We also want to be very careful in this environment, with the exception, I'll say the uncomfortable thing, with the exception of a few people in this photo, everyone here is white and we're working in East Africa. That's an inherently problematic issue that we have to be very sensitive to. So when we're talking about housing, we don't want to inflict our own bias from a wealthy Western nation. So that's why we're working at the material scale. And we're relying on the rules of thermodynamics to tell us the interventions to make. So the same thing with the Ecotone project. We keep it simple, we do one thing, and we rely on laws of basic science. The idea is that we're taking global health interventions out of the hands of scientists and engineers and putting it in the hands of the researcher, the brick maker, the community member, and builders. This is how bricks are made there. So this is not in a factory. If you're going to build a home, we're working in Tanzania, I'm not sure if I said that, which is in East Africa. So these are mud bricks, and we're looking at new ways for those new things that those bricks can do. Bricks are an accepted material, and they can do a lot of work without changing the cultural status of the material. So I'll show a few examples. My classes are typically 45 minutes long, and so I have like a 42-minute length on my voice, and I'm right at 41 minutes. So that's usually like my cue to stop talking, but I'm going to just go for a few minutes longer. So this is called the Venturi block. This is something that this is all graduate student work in the early years of the program, looking at the principle of the Venturi effect. So what the Venturi effect says that a reduction in pressure, constriction, increases velocity of air. So the same way if you, can't believe I'm going to do this, but if you, in your mouth, if you just blow out air, you don't get a lot of velocity. If you constrict your lips, you get a lot more, sorry for all the hot air I just got all over the place, you get a lot more velocity from that air. And so what that does in this example is that you increase the cooling effect of the wall, but you also increase the turbulence of the air so that the mosquito can't fly. So it has a comfort effect, but it also has a health effect because you're not getting the mosquito flight. Mosquitoes are going to go somewhere else where it's more comfortable to fly. Because they're lazy, which is a good thing. If they can't fly, they're going to go bite someone else. Because this is a design studio, we translated these principles from the material scale to the building scale. So again, we're really trying to check our own bias and have the laws of thermodynamics guide us. So that in this example, he designed a home where with the constriction, it would pull the air through the walls. So this is where he had his brick wall. But it would also pull the smoke away from the cooking, which has its own health implications, using biomass for cooking. Another project used the concept of vortex shedding. So if you've ever seen the diagram of, or a truck, an 18-wheeler, or a building where when wind hits it, it gets this pocket of air on the backside of it. What he's doing is creating a similar effect where you can ventilate air through, but you're essentially creating a air trap for the mosquitoes to get caught in. So it disrupts their flight, but it also brings in fresh air. So we're not wanting to seal our buildings up, we're wanting to bring in the air, but also deal with the health effects of that outdoor air. So at the building scale, you'll see his plan looks a lot like the brick. And what he created was a maternal health center, because in parts of this country, a lot of the more rural regions do not have access to good health care, especially in close distance. So for pregnant women who have an at-risk pregnancy, the idea is that they come to this center at times where it's safe to travel, and then they can use these pavilions as, they stay there, it's their housing, it's a waiting area, give birth in a safe environment, and then they can return home. So conceptually, the idea is that, pregnancy can be a traumatic, disruptive time, but it's a moment to find peace and safety, and it also has the effect of less biting of pregnant women, which is a risk to unborn children. So we tried to have this idea that was developed to the material scale translate to the structure of the building, the design concept, and the program as well. So he had these pavilions, and at a programmatic level, the women could come here to to essentially ride out a moment of turbulence in their lives. So these are just quick examples, but the goal of this project is to take something so simple, so accessible, this is the most common building material in the world, and just rethink it a little bit. Question its use. The project is ongoing, and we have, it's largely been a conceptual thought exercise that's just taken place inside of our school, and it's not something that we're bringing to our partners in Tanzania. They want prototypes, they want working examples. We want to work with the builders. We developed these very graphic books so that we could communicate our ideas to the builders and use their lived experience. We don't want to be working with the scientists and engineers and kind of deploy these ideas to these communities. We want to be working from the bottom up, from the materials, so there's ownership. It's not like the bed nets that are not being used, it's that this is part of the home, which is the most personal thing to a family. So, in summary, as a designer, always question your relationship with nature, buildings, and the planet. And thank you. I will say this is a quick plug. If you scan this QR code, it brings up a page to my new book, which it comes out on March 14th. So if you're interested in some of these images like the baby cage or some of the other weird ones, those are all in there. And it also includes chapters from a microbiologist, an anthropologist, and 2 architects. And you can also follow me on Instagram, Liz and her BS for building science, just to be clear.